Our second speaker is David Chung. We unfortunately can't be here with us tonight because he's on call in an A&E department at Crosshouses University Hospital in Kilmarnock. David Chung originally trained as a surgeon, but is now an emergency medicine doctor and is in fact Vice President Scotland of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. He's going to give a recorded talk. He feels that very strongly that managed death should be a core function of an emergency department. It's a critical moment to talk to patients, if possible, and their relatives. He realizes that it's quite difficult to discuss these sort of major issues in the emergency department, but feels that's the right place. So we're going to hear his recording.
Hi there, my name's Dr. David Chung. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine at Crosshouse Hospital in Kilmarnock. Formerly worked with the Royal College of Emergency Medicine and also a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Glasgow. Crosshouse is quite a busy department. It's actually the fourth busiest in Scotland. And throughout my career, sudden death has been a feature, unfortunately, part and parcel of emergency medicine doctors' jobs. For a department of our size, which pre-COVID would be seeing about 75,000 patients a year tops, it's gone down to about 60 now, we could expect to get about 100 people, unfortunately, end their lives in an emergency department. And COVID hasn't really affected that. The numbers are about the same, even though proportionally it's gone up a wee bit. Of those people, I'd say about roughly half are people who've come in and they're clearly at the end of their life, often quite elderly, DNA, CPR in situ, that sort of business. And they're a slightly different population with regards to things like tissue donation and organ donation. We have about 50 people, though, who are youngish, fittish people of out of hospital cardiac arrest who are brought to us. Those numbers have decreased because there's been changes in the policies from the Scottish Ambulance Service, and they are, their advanced paramedics are allowed to quite rightly pronounce life extinct in situations. But we still get a fair amount of people coming in. So once a week we'll have somebody coming in. Unfortunately, we're not able to save, and we might be in a position to consider tissue donation. We can't really do organ donation, obviously, for somebody who's had a cardiac arrest, but increasingly over my career, we've been able to obtain different parts of people who are able to help with regards to things like heart valves and such like. In terms of my career, I started this journey over 20 years ago. I remember 1999 at the Victorian Infirmary, we started to consider being able to ask people for corneal donations. And the process at that point was perhaps very different to how it is now. And I'm pleased to say a lot of things have got a lot better. But one thing that hasn't changed in the past 22 or so years that I've been involved in these conversations and doing it, it has not got any easier for reasons that are quite fundamental. You're dealing with families who maybe saw a loved one leave the house that morning. They had no inkling at all that anything like this was going to happen. They left the house, they were going to work, they were going to the shops, going to the golf course, whatever. And the first they've heard is that their loved one's been brought to your ED, and they may have some inkling, they might know that they've unfortunately died. They may have no inkling of that whatsoever. Nobody's kind of passed it on or found a warning shot. And the first time they meet you and you have a conversation or interaction with you is you're telling them that their world is ending potentially, that their future has disappeared as far as they were having it. And it's very shocking news in a difficult situation. It's always from the point of view of the perspective, let's say, of the clinician doing that. It's unpleasant. It needs to be handled sensitively. It's always difficult. It never becomes easy. And to discuss something like tissue donation is quite frankly scary. And it's still just as scary now for me to do it. I have apprehension, as it would be when I was a relatively inexperienced registrar 22 years ago. To have that conversation, to have the guts to say to somebody, I'm really sorry that your loved one has died, but have you thought about tissue donation? It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel respectful. It doesn't feel like it's appropriate in some ways, even though it is. So anything that can make that process easier for both sides, especially the relatives, is to be welcomed. But it still remains, I think, quite a brutal situation to find yourself in. What has got easier is the process has developed. So I remember when we first started this process that I mentioned, we'd be kind of asking for consent then and there, and that would be, with hindsight, that's really not the way to do things. So within minutes of delivering this shocking news, even giving people a bit of time to come to terms with things, then going back and tentatively asking if they'd ever considered anything about this, if they were in the affirmative, if they knew their relative had strong opinions and was always very keen on doing anything like this, there's a whole load of paperwork and such like to go through. There'd be consent procedures and such like. I'm pleased to say things have changed since then. But it would say it's still the ED staff who are going to be doing this. There's been a lot of work. We have tissue and transplant coordinators who provide a lot of support for us. But I remember at the start of this, there was lots of people who were saying to me, look, you can do this. If you do these things, it's quite easy. All you have to do is follow these simple steps. And actually, most relatives are okay with being asked, and they're actually quite comfortable. And in the past 20 years or so, I'll be honest, it's only ever really been ED staff who are having these conversations. I realize that lots of people have given us advice saying, oh, this is what you do. But when it comes to this emergency situation, whereby people are being told there's been an unexpected bereavement and we're going to consider tissue donation, it is mostly, with one or two exceptions that I can recall over the past 20 years, an ED member of staff that's going to be doing this. It's not going to be somebody else, a tissue transplant coordinator or such like, especially as because many people die out of hours statistically, more die out of hours than in the Monday to Friday 9 to 5 period. So it's obviously going to be us. So any help we can get with regards to this will be gratefully received. And things have changed for the better. So now, very clear guidance from transfusion service, systems have improved, and we aren't expected to have to sit there kind of anxiously wondering what we should do, just broaching that subject at what seems like it might be an appropriate juncture in the proceedings. Most of the time, I'll be quite honest, we don't ask because people feel at the time that there isn't an appropriate juncture. It's not something to be asked at, or they'll think people are perhaps too old to have tissue donation or other sorts of reasons. COVID has driven things down because for a long while people thought because of the risk of COVID there wasn't going to be anything happening either. But the situation is better. The process should flow is that we can check the organ donation register before we speak to the family, or we'll ask a tissue transplant coordinator to do so. And we won't even have to worry about mentioning this at the start. So we can actually do what we should do, break the bad news, give the family some time to adjust, think about things, acceptance, and come to terms with things a wee bit before we even start to go down the route of, do you think they had any views on tissue donation and such like. So if the tissue transplant coordinator says, no, this patient previously had given a preference, had said their organ donation register, we could then broach the subject with the family and say, is it something they considered? Would it be okay with you if tomorrow, you don't have to do anything today, somebody from the transplant service will contact you to discuss if you have any thoughts about this or whether it's something they might be interested in. And that's been very helpful as well, that development, because there was certainly urgency around being able to retrieve tissues before that. We now don't have to worry so much. The perception from our part was always it needs to be done very quickly. Now we know that there's up to 48 hours of the patients in the mortuary. So that's an improvement. We know we're not acting against the clock. We know there's time for consideration, time for adjustment, and that's much better. I think with regards to how the law change might benefit us, the main thing that it's going to do, hopefully, is raise awareness of tissue donation and how it might benefit other people, and make people perhaps consider what their wishes would be and discuss them with their family. The situation for the past 20 years has always been very much the family have the ultimate decision here. They've always been able to express their wishes, and from our perspective, it definitely feels that they've been able to veto in some cases patients who've died. We found an organ donor card, but the family said, no, we're not happy about it. Certainly some things that happened once the whole Alder Hayes situation came about, people were very much more reluctant and mistrustful of medical science in general and handling of people after death. But I think hopefully we're getting to the other side of that now and things are improving. The law, as I see from this, it's a little bit unclear to us at the sharp end how we're going to address it. Our processes, from what I can see, aren't going to change materially. We're still going to have to speak to families, ask them if they consider donation after responding to an organ transplant coordinator. What isn't clear for us is that, you know, if there's no express wish, then we're in the situation with the law that it would appear that consent is presumed. But we're still going to have to say to the family, do you know if it's anything they thought about? And they might say at the time, well, actually, we don't want it to happen. We're not quite sure what happens then. Does an organ transplant coordinator still phone them the next day? Do we just say, well, that's it, and phone back the organ transplant coordinator and say they've said they're not happy and we just leave it at that? And that in some ways still puts the onus for some of these hard conversations for us to do in the emergency department. They're still going to be there. So in some ways it feels that we're still going to have these perhaps difficult situations we might feel a bit nervous about. We're also not sure is should we be phoning the organ transplant coordinator as a matter of course like we are just now, or does the change in the law mean that we don't have to do that? Does it mean that we automatically then have to speak to everybody? In which case it makes things more difficult for emergency department staff, because if we're not phoning organ transplant coordinators, we'll just be having this conversation every single time, which is how we were doing it before, which is in some ways going to cause a little bit of reticence and perhaps some anxiety amongst us, because as I've said, no matter how long you've been doing this, each death for a family is theirs. They own it. You're treating an entire family every time somebody dies in any clinical setting, and it's always going to have its individual circumstances you're going to deal with. It's easy if people know what the relatives want and the whole family are on board and wish to do something like tissue donation, but if they've never thought of it or they have strong opinions against it, it's going to be difficult and it might arouse negative emotions. I must admit, in the past 20 years, I've generally not had very angry reactions or really difficult situations to deal with. There have been one or two. I have physically been threatened once for even bringing up the subject, even just following all the guidelines. Do you know what they would have thought? All this sort of things, not bringing in. So there is always that anxiety that somebody might take it the wrong way, and I think that's something, you know, we just have to live with. But it would say my experience over the past 20 years of breaking bad news to people, it's not normally been the case. But you don't know what people are thinking, and you are nervous or you're wondering after the patients have left and that the family have left, was it the right thing? Was it the right thing to bring up? Are they going to look back on that? Because people live with the effects of a sudden death or any death for the rest of their life. As I say, you're treating the relatives when someone dies because they're going to carry that experience for them for the rest of their life. And the anxiety is you've done it in some way badly or brought up something they didn't want to speak about, and that's what they're going to reflect on as the years go by. So broadly, anything that gets people talking and accepting that death is a part of our life and what people might wish to do, might wish to help other people after their own death by donating their tissues and their organs. This is a good thing, and I welcome it as a society that we're talking about it. But this law is still going to mean that we are going to have to be as good as we can be at having these difficult conversations. And there are some bits around the introduction of the law that I think guidance would be welcome for people who are doing this at very, very acute end, in sudden and unexpected scenarios, to know, is there anything we can do to minimize any harm, distress, or any problems with regards to how people might feel about it on both sides of the conversation as we go into this new era. Thank you very much for listening to my views. They are all personal. They don't represent any particular body. They're just some of the things that I've observed and some of the issues which I feel anybody breaking unexpected bad news might have felt or might be wondering how the new law is going to affect us in this situation. Thank you.
Thank you, David. That was a very thought-provoking talk. I wonder if John could come back on and perhaps we can have a discussion about some of the points raised, and we also have some questions now. So what do you think about guidance, John, for people at the front end? They are in a difficult position. He made a good point about the legislation prompting people to think about transplantation, which I think is very important. But he also talked about the ability of relatives to override an individual's wishes, and also the assumed consent. So what do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, a number of points there. I think guidance is something that I've been working a great deal on in Scottish Government, and in bringing in the local clinical leads for organ donation in various different trusts, and trying to encourage education within each of the different boards. So I think guidance and help in that way is really important, and also what we're trying to achieve. The other aspect, sorry, what else did you ask me? A couple of other things as well. There was
the power to override. Yes. What if the relatives are not happy to consent? How would you take that? I think I know the answer. I'm just
yeah. I mean, well, if the relatives really refuse to consent or authorize, then donation won't go ahead. And so that's part of this legislation. However, the process or the approach from either the specialist nurses for organ donation, or a group of nurses that we who are becoming more involved in organ donation in Scotland, are specialist requesters, who are once a potential donor has been referred to them, will come and talk to the family and take them through the process. And if the donor has expressed a wish to donate, and their name is on the organ donor register, or indeed they have had conversations with their families which are very positive around organ donation, then it makes it more difficult for families to override. But ultimately, if the family really does not wish organ donation to go ahead, then it won't go ahead.